At Prodigy Leadership Academy, we are raising up tomorrow's leaders. And Talks with Titans is one of the ways that we're facilitating the passing of torches from people who have lived lives of success and impact onto our students. So in today's episode, one of our high school students, Brody, had the chance to sit down with Dr. Brad Robison. Dr. Robison is a local psychiatrist, and he's just incredible. Every single time that I get the chance to have a conversation with Dr. Robison, I come away with new insight into understanding myself and just the world around me. It's fascinating. I love listening to him talk. And Brody asked some great questions in this episode. So I'm really excited for you to hear Dr. Robison's story of how he got to where he is today and his experience with psychiatry as a profession and what he sees in America's youth today.
Well, I'd like to kick off a question because I've just always been really impressed and thankful with the way that you interact with people, me in particular. Yeah. But and I know you support a lot of young people around this region. And I was just now talking, before this video started, we were talking about how young people are influenced by the people in their lives in terms of their career pathway, their direction, their skill sets. Yeah. What influenced you early on to think, I want to move in the direction of the medical field and particularly how the brain works?
Oh, yeah. Lots of influences there. And I mean, you guys will help me focus some of that, because even that question, there's just a ton of fun stuff to talk about, people that have influenced me and all of that. I think a few things that really impacted me growing up is my father was a big influence on me. He was an educator, elementary principal, superintendent of schools, and but we also grew up on a small farm, and so we grew up kind of with this mix of my father, who had a lot of training and education, but we were very grounded in a small farm community and family and connection and all of that. And so those were, his influences in working with kids, I think was an influence on me. And my mom was a part of that, and growing up with, two brothers and a sister, going to church, being involved in youth groups, and all of those things were big influences on me. But then there were things that happened. I mean, I didn't, growing up in, Puxico, Missouri, and with that background, it wasn't at the top of my mind of being a psychiatrist. It's like, oh, you're going to go be a psychiatrist. No, not at all. That wasn't, what was on my mind. I was interested in, the sciences and things like that. Had some really great high school teachers, a couple of great high school science teachers that I think influenced me a lot to just learn. And God love them. I mean, me and a few of my friends at Puxico were probably, it's not like we were, on the one hand, it's not like we were getting in trouble, but on the other hand, we were probably hard to deal with because we had, they offered us some independent study classes because we were just rolling through material, and so they offered us independent study classes, and we learned a lot from those teachers, but looking back on it, I realized how hard those teachers worked to help us learn, because we were, teenage boys that were, we wanted to learn, but we also wanted to goof off an awful lot. And so they were a big influence on me. Another huge influence on me, growing up, was a church youth group that I was involved in, and being able to be involved in some leadership things there influenced me. While I was going through all of that, I spent my 16th birthday in St. Francis Hospital with a collapsed lung, and I had a series of collapsed lungs over the course of a year, where I ended up having to have multiple chest tubes placed in the emergency department, which is not fun, but and then ended up having to have a surgery. So back at the time, the surgical group, back then. I mean, Dr. McGinty, you know, people in the community here know and respect. I mean, just that whole group, every one of them at some point put a chest tube in me. And so I got to know them and a little bit, I mean, as a teenage patient, and I just thought the body and all that was fascinating. I was like, wow, show me a picture of my, you know, I was like looking at the pictures from the surgery of my lung and, you know, what's this and what's this. And so they did a great job, you know, just kind of, you know, that was a big influence on me, and kind of those are the kinds of things that led me down the path towards medical school. And then in medical school at Mizzou, I went to undergrad here at SEMO and then medical school at Mizzou. And, you know, Mizzou's still to this day holds up as one of the best medical schools in the country, in my mind, for clinical teaching. I mean, we learned a lot, and it was a great learning environment. I was focused on pediatrics, you know, growing up in rural Southeast Missouri, growing up interested in working with kids and families. My dad had that interest, was passionate about working with kids and families. I kind of got that. I got that through working in youth groups and things like that. And I was thinking pediatrics. And so I was going down that path, and then my psychiatry rotation as a third-year medical student, of course, I was thinking about pediatrics, so I tried to, you know, a few of us could take a child psychiatry rotation, and so that were interested. So I did my psychiatry rotation on the child psych unit and had some, again, mentors. I mean, I had fantastic mentors there. You know, the attending physician and one of the chief residents in child psychiatry were incredibly helpful mentors, and it kind of opened my eyes to what psychiatry really was about. Because, you know, I don't know, probably had all the stereotypes and misconceptions and stuff. And so I made the decision as I was, you know, finishing up med school there. I matched at the University of Utah's triple board program, so psychiatry, child psychiatry, and pediatrics. And so I went out there and did more pediatric training and more psychiatry training. And one story that I tell sometimes, and, you know, I was already headed down the path of psychiatry, but I still had sort of one foot in both worlds in Utah. Fantastic training there also. Great mentors. But one night in the emergency department, and I've told this story before to different people that I talked to about this. I was literally sitting on one side of the hallway with a teenage girl, and all the resources of the hospital were sitting on literally like right across from me in the trauma bay with a teenage boy. The only difference between the two was that the girl was thinking about suicide and the boy had shot himself in the head. And I decided then, I mean, God had already directed me towards psychiatry, but I decided then I was learning to do the trauma stuff. I wasn't a trauma junkie like some of my buddies were, you know, that were just incredible. Some of the guys that I went to med school with and was in that residency program with were just amazing in those crisis situations. And I was learning to do that. And there were aspects of that I liked. There were aspects of that I really liked in terms of pediatrics. But that experience really solidified that what God has called me and gifted me in is this area where not very many people are. So, you know, it really pulled me in to, you know, and solidified my commitment to, you know, the last going on 30 years now, you know, of this work, and trying to, you know, connect and learn and understand, and join God in what He's doing in the lives of people, teenagers especially, you know, kids and teenagers and adults and all those things. So that's how I got, that's one layer of how I got here, and it still gets me emotional, but
you did mention a lot of mentors that were kind of important in your life. Would you like to talk about a few that were particularly impactful?
I mean, my dad, huge influence on my life. My mom was also just a huge influence. So, we could talk about those things. But other mentors that made probably one of my mentors that was the most impactful for the longest was a gentleman, James Hyde. Dr. Hyde had a PhD in marriage and family therapy and a PhD in theology, and he had a dual appointment at Southern Seminary and at the University of Louisville, which I transitioned from Utah to Louisville for a few years to finish up my training in general psychiatry and in child and adolescent. And then Dr. Hyde was my mentor in marriage and family therapy, and he and I continued a mentoring relationship for years after I finished my training. We would meet regularly by phone. I'd sometimes go back to Louisville and spend the weekend at his house with he and his wife, and he was just a fantastic mentor. And Dr. Hyde was the director at the university in the Department of Psychiatry of the Wayne Oates Institute. And Wayne, I got to know Wayne a little bit. I mean, he had retired. I didn't really get to know him as well as I would have liked. But Dr. Oates was kind of one of the founding people in our country in pastoral care and counseling. That really wasn't a thing before Wayne Oates, and after Wayne Oates it was. And I think he's written, I don't know how many books, a lot of books on, mental health and faith and spirituality. So Dr. Hyde directed the Wayne Oates Institute and was my mentor in marriage and family therapy, but also really helped me to develop, I would say, in an academically rigorous way, my integration of body, mind, and spirit, my understanding of the biology of the brain, the psychology of the mind, the social aspects of human interactions and human systems, including family systems, and all of that in the context of a rigorous and challenging exploration of God and God's role in all of that, and our relationship with God and all of that. So Dr. Hyde was incredibly influential on me and multiple of my colleagues that went through. He just had, like any great mentor, he had just these pearls of wisdom. And some of my colleagues and I, one of my colleagues, I can't find it. I don't think I've got a copy of it, and I wish I had kept a copy of it, because one of my colleagues put together a list of what we called Hydeisms, and they're just really just pearls of wisdom. And so he was a huge influence on me professionally and in developing and doing what I do every day. So he was probably the biggest influence. Yeah.
Some people have a view that there is tension between the world of science and the world of faith, but
right.
You're an acting scientist.
Right.
And you treat people, and you have all that training. But what do you think about that, science and faith? Are they compatible, or is there tension between them?
Yes and no, in that, like, you have to define your terms, to really, start diving into that. And because if we really are careful about defining our terms and encouraging the people that we're having that kind of conversation with to define their terms, it's a challenge, because what you're talking about really is worldviews, and the worldview, the materialistic worldview of the modern or postmodern scientific community, it is dominated by a worldview that some have held up as a alternate worldview to, theistic worldviews in general, let alone Christian theistic worldviews. And so in that sense, there is conflict, or there is, disagreements. But in practical realities, I don't find it. I'm a clinician, so my job is applied science in a sense, and in that world, I find less tension or conflict. We're applying the scientific principles to explore the realities of, the brain, and we've had tremendous advances, in the last 20 years, the last 10 years, in our understanding of the neural networks of the brain and all of those sort of things. And we've had tremendous advances in our understanding of the mind and how the mind works, and how the mind and the brain interact. They're not the same thing, but they are overlapping and interacting. The mind is embodied in the brain, but it's not the same thing as the brain. And then, the spiritual aspect of things. Here in this office, when people get to the point of their existential crisis, they may have, lots of questions about, what is this world all about? Who am I? How do I fit into the world? Is there a God? Is there not a God? If there is a God, what does God have to do with me? But when they, when they strip down to what James, another Haidism, James always taught us, the difference between intellectual theology and operational theology. Your intellectual theology is what you tell yourself that you believe. And you may know a lot about what you tell yourself that you believe, and you may be able to articulate a very clear worldview, theistic or atheistic. You may be able to articulate a very clear worldview. You may be able to argue it incredibly well. And it may have, not always, but it may have very little to do with your operational theology, how you actually operate in a crisis, how your mind actually operates when you're dealing with conflict with your spouse or your kids or a colleague or a student, how you actually operate when you're faced with loss or trauma or death or So those two things are very different, the intellectual theology and the operational theology. Yeah, they're very different.
Would you a synonym for those words, would that be beliefs versus convictions? You believe something that you've shaped in your worldview, but your conviction based on your life experience perhaps might tell you something different.
Yeah, that I think might be a way to also kind of understand it or operationalize it. I think the thing about operational theology that's even different than what sometimes people think about in terms of belief or conviction, as a term, those two terms still are very frontal lobe intellectual terms. And operational theology is a way, it's, I guess, also an intellectual term, but how I understand it is, and what I'm looking for when I'm sitting in the office, is something that is operating at a deeper level of the mind and the brain. Literally, I mean, it's not a frontal lobe. If we look at it from a brain structure, it's not so much a frontal lobe operation. It's a deeper. It's deeper structures that are activated and engaged, and they may limbic structures, which are emotion, interacting with kind of language structures of the brain. If we've been fortunate to grow up with a tremendous amount of kind of love and support, hopefully we have a very active prefrontal cortex, which helps us integrate our experiences and literally integrate various parts of the brain. But the prefrontal cortex operates much more automatically than the frontal cortex, the frontal lobes operate. So the frontal lobes are like the blackboard of the mind, where everything's written and you're aware of your belief and you're aware of your convictions and you're able to articulate it. The prefrontal cortex is what governs things behind the scenes, and you have to it takes a little work to be able to go, oh, wait a minute, I can recognize how I flowed through that. I can begin to pay attention to what I'm paying attention to. And operational theology is in that area. It's the part that starts to learn how to pay attention to what you're paying attention to.
This is so fascinating. I don't think I've ever been so right. Like right now, I just want to understand how Dr. Robison's mind works when he sits down to talk to somebody.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like all the stuff that he's thinking about.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's interesting. It's fun doing this sort of thing and just being able to, see how incredibly fascinating and beautiful people are. I mean, the mind, the brain, but just the uniqueness of the individual is just, amazing, amazing. Tell me a little bit about yourself. I'm going to put you on the spot. Tell me a little bit about yourself and what your thing is in terms of like what your interests are, and then like as a teenager and looking towards the future and you being in this chair someday. Tell me about that.
I'm a big fan of cats. I'm interested in all kinds of like bugs and stuff. People tell me I should be some kind of zoologist. I say no. I'm actually more interested in writing. Really? Ideally, I'd be able to become an author. Likely that would be a part-time thing for a while.
Yeah.
I'm very interested in kind of like the weirder areas of writing, like weird fiction and stuff. I take a lot of inspiration from different writers like H.P. Lovecraft and Robert E. Howard in that kind of sort of realm. Like I said, I love animals. I play video games now and then. I like to think I'm a very imaginative, creative person. Yeah.
So you said, there's a ton there, but like one of the things that you said that jumped out at me was, in terms of the writing, you would like to be a writer someday, but that'd probably be a part-time thing or something like that. You're like, so somewhere inside there's a part of you that's going, well, is that really going to work? And can I make money at that? And so tell me about that. Like, what's the dilemma there for you? What are you seeing now at your stage going, well, could this really work? Can I make money at that? What?
Well, I've heard it's a very hard industry to get into.
Yeah.
So ideally, I would have some kind of stable means of income while I work on pursuing that.
Yeah. Yeah. Nice. Yeah, I think that's insightful on your part. I mean, a lot of times I look at stuff like that and I'm like, there's no way, kid. There's no way you can do that. You can't make money at that. Brush that aside. Go get a real job, right? Except for the fact that that's not true. Except for the fact that you can. What I see in my office every day with students just like yourself who have interests and passions and things that they're pursuing, and I think it's what caught my attention about that phrase when you said, well, yeah, but I may have to get a job and do this on the side, is that so many students that I work with are unrealistic about the work that it takes to get there. So like if you're not realistic about the work that it takes to get there, then the reality is being a writer is a pipe dream. You're not going to do it. I mean, it's just like, oh my God, the number of students that I've had come in here for the last 15 or 20 years probably who are telling me they're going to be a video game designer. No way. There is no way. Or I'm going to be a YouTuber. No way. No way. There's no way. But why I say that is not because it's not possible, but they haven't realized that because I like to play video games, then I'm going to be a video game designer. You have to put in the work. Now, I have some guys. I've got one young man right now. He's killing it. He's put in the work. He knows what it has taken to be a video game designer, and he puts in the work, and he's doing a really good job. So I really like the fact that you're going, well, I'm not sure what it's going to take exactly, and I may have to figure out some way to make money to pay the bills for a while, but if you're willing to do that, if you're willing to do whatever it takes to pay the bills, and you're willing to put in the time to hone your craft, it's very possible. My oldest son is an example of that. My oldest son was garage band, comes home and tells his, mom and I, Jake's his buddy. Jake and I are going to start a band. We're like, well, you might want to learn to play an instrument first. and so, but every iteration, they kept working at it, and they kept working at it, and they kept working at it, and they did. They were the garage band, the 7th grade garage band, and then they advanced to doing shows for their friends, and then they advanced to doing shows around the community, and then by the time they reached their peak they've had various iterations of bands, but by the time they reached their peak, they were touring around the country and were making somewhat of a living. I mean, they still had to work other jobs too, and then they got to a point where they were just like, yeah. So Jake is leading worship. He's got a family and 3 kids, and he's leading worship. And my son's working on a PhD and in engineering and all that. But it's possible, is the point of that story. I mean, you have to just be willing to put in the work. So that's cool. I mean, continuing to hone your craft. Do you write?
Yeah.
Okay.
Pretty often.
Okay.
I think one thing is it's a big thing in today's society. It's like we're always telling kids it's like you can grow up and do anything you want. And we don't it's like a whole like hidden contract that we're not telling them about, except it takes this.
Yes. Yes. That's a good way of putting it. It is. I think there's 2 aspects of that, what you're talking about there, Brody. One aspect is the hidden contract of saying, well, okay, to do that, it takes this, and this. And sometimes we don't. And then the other aspect of that I think is such a struggle, and I've said it for 30 years, the biggest lie, and we are kind of reaping the whirlwind because of this lie, but the biggest lie that we've told, kids in this country is that you can be anything you want to be. That's a lie. It's intellectually dishonest, and it's a complete lie. It's not true. You can't. Like, Shaquille O'Neal might have wanted to be a Kentucky Derby winning jockey, right? My life's goal is to be a Kentucky Derby winning jockey. Never going to happen. Now, he makes a pretty darn good basketball player, you know, and so to me, that's the deal. I mean, there's this thing of like coming to terms with who you are, what your passions are, and blending that together with hard work to find your path. And from that standpoint, there's no limits. Go find it. Go get it done. You know, find mentors, find people that'll help you do it, and go get it done. And you know, write every day. You know, spend time writing. Find people to read what you're writing critically. You know, find people who are going to read what you're writing and go, man, this is great and this is great, and you lost me here. I have no idea where you were going. What was that all about? You know, find people that will read what you're writing and be critical. You know, like constructive. You know, but like give you honest feedback about it, and then keep writing again. You know, write again, write more. Just keep going. Yeah.
I want to land on that notion of receiving criticism, because I'm curious what you think, Brody, about this, and also you, Dr. Robison. It seems to me that when I come across people in my sphere of influence and want to give a little bit of supportive, critical feedback for the potential to understand something from another perspective, maybe, or to recognize an area of growth potential. When I share anything as affirmatively as I possibly can share it, but it still has a little embedded critical element, I find that these days it seems like people are crushed by that. They almost immediately become self-defensive, self-protective, walls go up. Do you see that too from your point of view? Do you think that constructive criticism is something that people in general, according to your observations, tend to welcome and receive and even look for it? Or do you think people are opposed to that?
I would say most people are like very like opposed or sensitive to it. I myself have been there. I feel like I've gotten to a point where I can take it and I can understand like, okay, that's something I can actually like improve on and I can do better next time. But there was a point where like somebody would be like, oh, you could have spoken a little louder when you're giving this presentation. And I'm like, how dare you?
Yeah.
Why are you coming at me like this?
Well, and you know, one of the things that I really respect, you know, Brody, I mean, as I've gotten older, you know, I came in this, you know, more, you know, science and then, you know, and all that, but I love good writers and good music, and you know, I think some of the most profound. I hate to use this term, but it's the term that everybody uses now. The most profound influencers. And I'm not talking about internet influencers. I'm talking about the people that have something to say, and say it the most clearly. The poets among us, you know, are the songwriters. You know, and the story writers and that sort of thing, and societies since the dawn of time have pushed aside the poets and the writers. On the one hand, you know, brushed them aside as like, well, we got to eat and we got to do stuff and we got to do something that's concrete and real and we got to, you know, and all that. But yet we go back to it's the poets and the writers that save us many times too, that help us see ourselves more clearly and see our situations more clearly and you know, those sort of things. And so part of where I was going with that, like for you and criticism, I really respect how challenging it is, because to be a good writer of a short story, to be a good writer of poetry, of songs, of good prose, that sort of thing, you have got to be able to put yourself out there. You've got to be able to explore the depths of what it means to be human, and you're the human that you're going to explore, right? I mean, you're gonna explore other people. You're gonna see what other writers have said about what it means to be human, but you're the human that you've got to explore, and so it requires an incredible amount of vulnerability And that requires, to really truly be vulnerable, requires a tremendous amount of, you've got to have a source of love and support somewhere in your life, people around you, and within yourself to be that vulnerable. Like one of the best poets in our society right now, in my opinion, there are a lot, and I'm not, completely, well read, but the best one that I is Tyler Joseph with 21 Pilots. I mean, absolutely amazing in terms of what he and Josh Dunn are doing with that band and with their songwriting and with the intricate narrative of life and what it means to be human and what it means to struggle and what it means to struggle with depression, what it means to struggle with life. I mean, absolutely amazing. And we went to their concert just not that long ago in St. Louis, and I mean, I would, this is a bold statement in some ways, but really, seriously, like I loved it. I loved being there, packed out, up there at the wherever the Blues play. I can't remember now. I'm blanking on the name of the stadium, but I mean, just packed out. And I think that their band has had more influence on teenagers than I've ever hoped to have in my career. And that's a lot of pressure for them, but I think they didn't set out to do that, but they're just honest, authentic, vulnerable, and finding a way to keep that going and tell an honest, authentic story, If you set out to influence people, you probably won't. If you set out to be authentic and genuine and real and tell an honest story, it will resonate deeply with people.
I think that's why I tend towards a lot of like heavier kind of style bands, is because like they're so like, there's just so much raw emotion there that I can understand, I can relate to. I hear these lyrics and I'm like, yeah, that sums it up. Like Jonathan Davis and Tool and all that. It's like I can hear that and I can resonate with that and I can understand like that's real.
Oh yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that's part of that we could, sounds like you and I could talk for a while down that path, because in some ways, I mean, I think that's one of the things. I mean, there's so many influences and so many things, and I don't, the music industry as we know it is just completely, I mean, it's just changing so rapidly. I don't know what it's going to look like even in just a few years. And there are some pros and cons to that. But I do think one of the good things that's coming out of it is, I think what is already happening, and I'm no expert. There's tons of people, you probably know it way better than I do even, but I do think that one of the things that's happening is you're going to have more and more corporate music, music by committee. We see that. I was talking with a young filmmaker, a guy that's, kind of a few years further down the road than where you're at, and he's pursuing filmmaking and he understands the work involved, and he and I were talking about that. It's like there's the film by committee, well, let's test this in our test market and see what and then you hear it, right? You hear it in the music, you see it in the movies. You're like, oh, okay, well here's this test market group they had to appease. Here's this test market group they had to appease. Here's this, and then they just string it all together and try to make it into a story, which all of that sucks. But then the positive side of that is I do think that is increasingly falling apart, and with the internet and all that, there is more and more outlets for good storytellers to find their voice, and it's hard work, and you're not going to make a ton of money. Like for most of the people out there in the independent films and in the independent, writing and music and all of that, you're not going to get, filthy rich. You can probably learn how to make a living at it if you're telling an authentic story and finding ways to connect with people. You can probably make a living at it and actually do quite well. Donald Miller's a good mentor for young people wanting to write. Donald Miller and his writings, and his style of writing may not be your style of writing, but if you're really interested in pursuing it, learn about Donald Miller's story, read his books. He shifted over, he does some marketing stuff, but he's a writer that kind of struggled with exactly what we're talking about and kind of came to terms with the fact that, if I'm a good writer, and then if I start taking over the business side of it myself, because I'm like good at writing and marketing is just telling a good story. And so he started taking that over and he figured out how to be successful from a business standpoint. And so, keep going, man.
I probably would do good to find a mentor because all my favorite writers are dead. So
yeah. Well, they can be incredible mentors too. Some of my favorite writers, some of my best mentors that I didn't talk about, C.S. Lewis has been a mentor of mine for many years, and I've never met him face to face, but I've read almost everything that he's written at this point. J.R.R. Tolkien, George MacDonald. I'm tackling George MacDonald, which is just recently I started tackling George MacDonald, and there are other writers that have been mentors in many ways, mentors.
Shifting kind of back to you, would you say this is like a hard job to apply like Christianity to in the workspace?
Yes and no. Yes and no. James, my mentor that I was talking about, really, really helped me understand that, because even before I met James, let me tell you another piece of my story. Even before I met James, when I moved from, Columbia, Missouri, Mizzou Med School to Salt Lake City, Utah, one of the things that happened while I was there is met a lot of, Mormon friends, had a lot of good Mormon friends out there, but it forced me to really grapple with my cultural Christianity. It's not like I was, Salt Lake City's not a third world country or a Muslim country. It's not in some ways, but it was different enough that I had to kind of think, well, now wait a minute. There is a lot of what I think and believe and how I do things that's just based on the culture that I grew up in. Really, it's just based on the culture that I grew up in. And so when I was in Utah, I had to come to terms with that. And I went through another mentor of sorts, I guess would be Henry Blackaby. I went through Henry Blackaby's Experiencing God Bible study. And that really helped me to understand at a deeper level, like everything in Blackaby's Experiencing God Bible study, I could have probably taught or told you about even back then in my life. Again, from an intellectual standpoint. But the experience of going through that study, how he organized it, and then going through it with a group of people while I was in Salt Lake City, Utah, forced me to go, do I believe that God really does pursue a love relationship with everybody? That's one of the, I say that, intellectual frontal lobes, I say that because that's what I grew up being taught I was supposed to believe or say. Do I really believe it? Am I willing to act on that every day in my relationships? Am I willing to pursue, that in my family, in my career? So when I was in Utah, I was forced to grapple with that, and met lots of great folks that had different aspects of belief than I did. From Mormons to people from all walks of life in an academic setting and all that. And then when I transitioned to the University of Louisville, and James really helped me explore that, and he helped me understand that my job, now there's a place for teaching and preaching and, expository teaching and apologetics. And I like a good, deep conversation about apologetics as much as anybody, right? But that's not my job here in this office. My job in this office is to create safe space, to create safe space, to create safe relational space where people feel comfortable and they feel like it's okay to be who they are, warts and all, struggles and all. And then as I join them, now I can't create safe space here by myself, but as you offer me some safety and trust, and I offer you some safety and trust, we create safe space together. It's okay to be connected and in relationship. And then in that safe space that we create, God shows up. God shows up and we begin to throw out our struggles, our hurts, our fears, our frustrations, our anger. We begin to throw out our existential questions. Who am I? Why am I here? Where is God? Is there a God? What kind of God? In that safe space, we begin to throw it out. And God shows up and makes it sacred. And we have those little moments, of like, well, what was that? Did you bring that into the room? No, I don't know. I didn't bring it into the room. Did you bring it in the room? And then you're like, oh, okay, we just experienced something together, and we're scratching our head and we're going, wow, that's something different, And so that's how I see what I do, and that is very, in my mind, that is very Christian. That is the core of Christian contemplative truth, I would say, and I can talk that language for a little bit. But the best book on that subject, my mentor that I mentioned a minute ago, C.S. Lewis, Surprised by Joy. So C.S. Lewis describes exactly that process when he describes, as a writer who was a powerful intellect, who understood the material world and extensively read in lots of things, including the sciences and the arts and literature and all of that sort of stuff, and really thought the material world was all that there was. But he had this friend, J.R.R. Tolkien, right? I mean, he had this mentor. He had this guy that he would go on long walks with, and they would talk about the stories they were writing. And Lewis says in his book Surprised by Joy, he left on a walk one morning with Tolkien on a misty morning, not a believer, and he returned a believer. And he says, what is that? That's okay. That's okay. He says, what is that? What was that that happened? And the best he could describe it as was joy. He said that as they were walking, he saw sunlight glistening on a dewdrop on moss. And he experienced something inside that all of his study, all of his understanding of the material world and all this sort of stuff, it didn't make sense. It's like there is no reason why that should be there in an evolutionarily driven world that's about a fight for survival. Now, in some ways, may feel like it's off track of your question of, integrate being a Christian and doing what I do. But here, I don't have to teach or preach. There are other places that I teach and other places that and sometimes I teach here, and I don't hesitate to talk about God. I don't hesitate to talk about Scripture from time to time if it fits or if it's helpful. But what I do is I go, what was that? And then the other, we've created safe space, and the other person goes, yeah, what was that? I'm like, I don't know, let's figure it out, right? And then we tear it apart and we're like, well, was that your biology? Was that some part of your brain chemistry that was off and, this or that's going on? Well, maybe let's explore that, right? Maybe. Because that happens, and I know a thing or two about that. Was that something about the way your mind is structured and your family, the influence of your family and all that? Well, yeah, maybe. Let's look at that, But then we begin to pull those layers back, and there are times that we're both like, wow, that was something. That was something bigger. That was transcendent. That was God. And then you begin to then I'm not teaching you what to believe. I'm not telling you, let's read the scripture about the fruits of the Spirit: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. I'm not telling you that. We're experiencing it together. We're going, wow, did you see that love? Did you see that joy? Did you see that patience? Did you see that? Did you feel that? I felt it. That's a real thing. That's transforming. And that's the presence of God transforming.
Yeah. It's like what you were saying a second ago about it's like this intellectual belief versus operational belief. It's like you could be sitting here telling somebody that stuff all day, but when you actually experience it and you let them realize that it's something completely different.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. It's very, very different, and it's harder earned fruit, but it's fruit that will last. Yeah.
It's good. I'm going to have to start calling these Bradisms, or because I was thinking Dr. Robisonisms. It's a little too long. It's
too long. Yeah, that's too long.
But I heard you say something that's still just going to resonate with me for a long time. If you start out wanting to influence people, you probably won't. Mm-hmm. If you start out being authentic and vulnerable, you probably will. Mm-hmm. I just think that there are these things. But earlier you mentioned something that just gets my mind racing about this prefrontal cortex and thinking about your thinking. And to me as an educator, I've often recognized how key this is to develop critical thinking skills, where you can take various perspectives, and also developing good relationships because you can empathize with other people, because you can go inside yourself to that deeper level of why are you doing what you're doing and how are you going to shift that so that it's better for someone else in the formation of relationships. Does everyone have that? Or some people are limited in their capacity to think about what they think about and really change it on purpose?
Yeah.
What is that?
Yes. Yes. It's, so that is a great question. And that is, let me give you two other names of mentors in a sense. So Dan Siegel, is a psychiatrist that's done tons of research on the brain mind and kind of founded the field of transpersonal neurobiology, and so he's really explored and others. Others have picked up and done a ton of research on the question that you're asking. Kurt Thompson has written. He's a Christian psychiatrist who's taken transpersonal neurobiology and integrated it in a lot of ways that I also see it and look at it through that same lens. And he's just written, just recently, in the last 5 years, he's got 3 books out that are really, really outstanding at diving into some of the question that you're talking about. But yeah, there's a huge amount of influences on how we process and how we get to the point of critical thinking and what is critical thinking and all of that. So one of the things that transpersonal neurobiology has helped us to understand is how the brain processes bottom up and right to left. I flip those around sometimes, so I may have got it wrong, but because I wasn't thinking about talking about this. But one of the phrases that I know Dr. Thompson talks about and others, and I like it, is that we first sense, and then we have to make sense out of what we sense. It doesn't actually work the other way. The brain doesn't work the other way around. That's the way the brain works, is you sense something, you have a sense of what's going, you take in physical sensations, auditory, visual, you're taking in all of these things, and our emotions are processing all of the information and all of that. And then we make sense out of what we sensed. And if you grew up where you had a lot of nurture and support to figure out, to make sense out of what you sense, then you develop that intuitive understanding of your operational theology. If you grew up in in a way that, for various reasons, discounted what you sensed, then many times you grow up with a very analytic frontal lobe, material, this A plus B equals C, and that sort of thing. And you need both. I'm not, it's not exactly like saying, well, one's better than the other. But what transpersonal neurobiology has helped us understand is when you do have that out of balance, you're running counter to the way the brain works, and so you're actively having to expend mental energy. It's not exactly like you know that you're doing it at a conscious frontal lobe level, but you're expending mental energy to suppress lots of different emotional parts and lots of different things that you're sensing, and like from a school, like I was just reading in the Prodigy Way, and like, so to bring that, like there's like books written on the topic, and I'm probably not doing a very good job of explaining it. I often say that I'm really, really great at taking something simple and making it complex. So I may be doing that with this, because there's whole books written on that. But to bring it back to a practical thing that I know you guys do at Prodigy and you guys have experienced, I was just reading a couple of the stories that Jessica wrote in the book about kids coming in, and some of the things that parents were talking about as they make the transition to Prodigy, and they just blossom in their creativity because they've been, kind of shoehorned into very standardized frontal lobe activities, learn the information, regurgitate the information, check the boxes, and I mean, there's a place for that. There's a place for that kind of structure. But in order to do that, you're also having to put a lid on exploring what you're sensing. Like, and then making sense out of what you're sensing. Now, that's a lot messier. It's harder to structure, but it's so much more, it just helps kids flourish in creative ways. So maybe that's somewhat
I'm so fascinated by the idea, and so what it sounds like you're saying is that when we encourage the student to explore what they're sensing and why they're sensing it, then we're opening that potential to develop metacognition, or thinking about thinking, and
absolutely.
Also the creative potential of that young person.
Yeah, you're really, and you educators know a lot of this at this point, but yeah, when you're doing that, you're affecting brain circuitry. You're laying down and developing more and more complex brain circuitry. In brain circuitry language, and who is it? It's somebody's principle. There's somebody's name associated with it, but it's the neurons that fire together, wire together. And so the more you fire a neural pathway, the more those neurons start getting wired together, and so you get better and better and better at firing that neural pathway. And so imagine like a tree, and if you're, and if all you've done for years is fire down one way of understanding something, like knowledge, like one way of like, this is what really knowledge is, what you're creating is a tree with very few branches. Now, it may be a big, strong tree, and there may be some strengths about it, but it has very few branches. And like literally, that's what the latest neuroscience research is showing us about neural networks and all that. And so if you're creating broad neural networks, you're encouraging exploration, you're encouraging exploring what you sense and making sense of what you sense. Now you've got a tree, literally a brain network that is massive amount of branches, massive amount of ability to process and solve problems and explore and all that sort of thing.
The kind of work you do, you support people that are going through the most challenging, difficult internal struggles and battles, and it seems like that would be very tiring, very draining.
Mm-hmm.
How do you stay full?
Yeah.
How do you have something to give every day?
It is challenging at times. So again, I don't want to sit here and say, yeah, I've got that all figured out, or that I don't have a bad day, or that because I do. I got tons of emotions, and they kind of can sometimes be all over the place. But I also have tons of support. I've had tons of support, in this, and so I've got lots of people around me that care about me and that understand what I do and that keep me grounded. My wife being the most, I haven't even mentioned her today, and she's clearly the most, influential person in my whole life. I mean, we've been together since I was 14 years old, to be honest. We dated through high school, and she grounds me, and she supports me, and we run this business together, and raise family together and take care of grandkids together. We ride bikes together. We just got back from a 9-day bicycle ride. We rode a tandem bicycle from downtown Pittsburgh, right at the confluence where the Ohio River starts, and we rode all the way to the Washington Monument in Washington, D.C. And so that kind of stuff grounds me and helps me to just be, grounded. And then my faith, my experience with God. I mean, a huge part of what's helped me have longevity here in this career is what I was talking about a minute ago about experiencing God. I don't carry the weight of this by myself. I don't feel like I'm, ever in a room with somebody by myself. And so I don't carry the weight of it by myself. I feel it. I feel deeply, the situations and the things that people are going through, but I don't have to carry the weight of it by myself. And that's what helps me. Yeah.
Thank you. Well, and also thank you for your time. It's just been, I just want to keep digging in more. I think there are a few people that I've come across that when they share a little bit about what they do and how they think, I just go, I need to know more. I need to understand something about this. And you're definitely one of those people.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it. Appreciate you guys, Brody. Appreciate you. I look forward to seeing what you write, out there and future and all those sort of things. That's cool.
Crazy stuff.
Yeah. That's great. All right. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.